and I'll share my screen here. All right, so here we see the Farnsworth house. And now that I have it to a level that's, fairly complete, I can start extracting plans, sections, and elevations. So how do we do that? Well, there's a couple things to be aware of and learn how to do it. So the basic command to use for creating or extracting any drawing from Rhino is called Make2D. So by typing in Make2D, it's going to ask me which objects to draw. I'll select my house right here and I'll hit enter. And that brings up this dialog box here. And essentially what this is asking me is, what settings do I want to extract some drawings? So you're always going to use this top setting for the projection settings. It's called View. And View, by selecting View, that essentially means that you will always be creating a 2D drawing of the view you are currently looking at. So right now, you'll notice that my top view, which is highlighted blue and over here, is the current selection. So if I go ahead and hit OK, it's going to think a little bit. It's generating some lines. Just by clicking or typing Make2D and selecting that view, you see here, I have already created a roof plan. So I haven't had to draw any of these lines myself. It just took what info it saw in Rhino and extracted that into some lines, our plan. You'll notice over here to the right that when I use the Make2D command, a bunch of new layers came up. And they are very conveniently sorted out for you. So everything that is a Make2D goes into this line work layer. So if I turn that layer off, that turns off all my lines. And there's these sub layers, visible and curves. So I'm going to take a step back for a moment and go back to the Make2D command so I can further describe some more settings of how to have more control over the layers that you are able to export. You'll see here that it's already created layers for anything that's a column. So anything that was in my pink layer previously stays on its own layer. My stairs are also on its own layer, and my floors are on its own layer. So I'm going to delete this right now and do that again so I can describe a little bit more about the settings. So I'm going to highlight everything and I'm going to Make2D. Okay, so back in this dialog box, as I've just described, we'll make sure to always have view selected. Let's talk about options. So object properties. The reason I was able to keep all those layers was because I've had selected here maintain source layers. I cannot stress enough how important it is to make sure that that is selected, because as you have probably already realized, even just by creating your own Rhino models, layers are your lifeline to be able to turn things off and stay organized. So be sure to have that selected. If you select any of these other options, those layers will not be as organized. There's different options here. You'll see there's an option for tangent edges. So if I select that, you'll see conveniently here that there's this little this little viewport that shows you what each of these lines mean. So if I select tangent edges, if I have a curved object in my Rhino model, it's going to essentially take the isocurves of that curved surface and also extract that as line work. So if you want that, you'll have tangent edges selected, and if you don't, obviously turn it off. Hidden lines, which is sometimes useful depending on what kind of drawing you're trying to make, essentially takes like a ghosted view of the objects you're trying to make 2D. So it'll export all of the line work that in your regular view you would see, but also shows what's beyond that shape, what's beyond that surface. So if you can imagine drawing like a cube, you know, you would dash in the things that you see behind the 2 or 3 surfaces that you would see regularly in real life. Scene silhouette. I would highly, highly suggest that you guys select this one. And it becomes really helpful in the future when you're trying to export drawings that you are going to use for diagrams. By selecting the scene silhouette, it essentially highlights the entire border of your model. And so for those of you who are familiar with some diagramming practices, you'll know that like if you're trying to make diagrams in the style of big architecture, Bjarke Ingels group, their diagrams always have this very heavy line weight around the perimeter of their diagrams. So if you're trying to create a diagram of your building, you can actually select the scene silhouette, and that'll export an additional line for you that you can later go back when you're post-processing and increase that line weight without having to go and retrace your entire building. Viewport rectangle, that's just going to export a rectangle around, it basically is the frame, the picture frame around what you're exporting, so not really important. Group output and register with previous, I'm actually not entirely sure what those do, and I'm not sure that they're useful because I mean, maybe they are. But the top 3 ones are ones that you definitely should know. All right, so let's hit OK. And again, we'll export our roof plan. So you'll see here that, again, it's exported all those layers for me. But now, if I turn off all my visible layers and I turn on my scene silhouette, oh, sorry, keep that on. We'll turn off all the curves. My scene silhouette has essentially taken everything that is a perimeter. So anything around my entire plan, just all the perimeter lines. Okay, so that's a roof plan. So you're probably questioning now, how do I create a floor plan? So to create a floor plan or a section, a command that you will need to know is clipping plane. So that's CLIPPING plane. So the clipping plane, you basically start out by drawing a basic rectangle. And this basic rectangle is the representation of a plane that you are using to cut through your model. So you see here, I have my clipping plane in my top view. And you'll see that it looks like it's, you know what, let me redo this. I'm going to start doing my clipping plane in my perspective view. So I'm going to draw a rectangle. And you'll see here that whatever view that I model my clipping plane in starts to cut through my model. So by default, it has cut at the C plane. You can, using the gumball, drag that clipping plane up and down. And a way to know which way the clipping plane is always facing is there's this line right here that indicates the direction. So anything that is located underneath this clipping plane remains visible. So that's essentially how I cut through my floor plan. If I want it to be exact, let's say, okay, let's bring this back to the C plane. Floor plans are typically cut 4 feet above the floor plate or the finish surface. So if I go, let's go to a front view. I'll put this at 4 feet. And that will be, you know, by standard drawing practices, the point that I will cut through my plan. So we see this happening in perspective view, but as you notice, it does not show up in any of my other viewports. And as we've discussed by now, you know that if I go to create if I go to use the Make2D command, if I highlight all of this in my top view, if I Make2D again, that floor plan is not going to show up as it's showing up in perspective. It's basically going to create my roof plan again. So what do I need to do? I need to select my clipping plane, and I need to mess around with its properties. So to do that, I go over to my Properties tab, and you'll see here there is a little clipping plane icon. So I'll head over to that clipping plane icon, and you'll see here that these are all my views. And right now, only the cabin perspective view is chosen. So if I select top view, there we go. I see the plan as it should show up in my top view. And I could also look at it in front view. See here that now that's coming through, and my left view if I wanted to. But I'm just going to leave it on top for now. So now I can go ahead and create my plan. Oh, one thing that might be useful is to create a new layer for your clipping plane. And if I create a new layer for my clipping plane and give it a color that is very bright, for example, green, and I'll change my clipping plane to that green layer. But I just find that helpful because then you get to see what it's cutting through in plan. It's kind of almost like a poche or a lineway, even though it's not exported yet. It's just, you know, for visual clarity, I find that helpful to see what is actually cutting through. All right, so let's Make2D this object. We'll verify that everything is selected by just, you know, checking in our perspective view. And as you know by now, we'll use the Make2D command. So these settings look okay to me. I'll hit OK. Wait for it to generate. Oh, whoops, sorry, I did that while I was in my perspective view. So yeah, make sure that you're in your top view when you're trying to export a perspective, or sorry, a actual plan view. So let's do Make2D. Okay, so there we go. That has been exported, and now we can move it. All right, so we have a roof plan and we have a floor plan. So how would I make an elevation? Can anyone guess how I would actually go about making an elevation?
Change the rotation or of the clipping plane, and then add either your left or right or front view onto your clipping plane from the properties.
So yes, you kind of have the idea. For an elevation, I actually probably don't need my clipping plane at all because I want to use what I'm looking at right here. So right now, I have my clipping plane turned on in the top in perspective view, but if I turned it on in my front view, when I would go to export my elevation, you wouldn't be seeing anything that was above the level of the clipping plane. So for
Oh,
an
I'm sorry.
elevation,
I thought I heard section. I'm sorry.
okay, no worries. But yes, you are completely right for how you would do a section. So yeah, I'll go ahead quickly and make a Make2D of my elevation. So you'll notice that I've done my Make2D in my front view, but by default, all of my Make2D items are basically laid flat in my top view. So even if you look in perspective, you'll see here that all of the Make2D items, come out flat. It's not aligned to the C plane in the vertical direction. So let's align that. And yes, May, 100% correct on the clipping plane. If you wanted to, you could even put in a new clipping plane, but I think that gets complicated having more than one. So let's just keep the one that we have. And actually, instead of creating so you're completely correct to how you would create a section. So you move your clipping plane, and we'll select the clipping plane, check the front view, and we could totally just go ahead and export this and have a regular 2D section. But you guys can get creative and actually do a section perspective. So you don't have to be limited to any sort of like 2D drawing types. So to create a section perspective, much like saving a perspective view, I would go first and find let's find a view that I like or best represents your project. So I'll say this is a good view. As always, we'll go and save that view. So if I go to this drop down arrow and I go to set view and to named views, I can save the view I've just created. So we'll call this section perspective. And I think I already have a section perspective in there, so I'm going to call it section perspective 2. Okay. So now if I go anywhere in space and I move around, I can always snap back to that view. So now you'll notice, and I'm actually going to select all my objects in another view, or I could go ahead and select my objects in this view. But if I do that, I'll actually also be selecting all of the line work I've already created. I could just be sure to turn off all my line work before I select everything, or I can go ahead and select everything in my top view or my front view. So now that we're back in this section perspective view, again, we do Make2D. And we'll hit OK. And that'll generate a bunch of lines for us. And let's turn on line work. And we'll see here my section perspective was created. And let me just make sure not to select all these other things. Okay. And there we have a section perspective. Notice here, and this will likely be the case when you guys go to export any of your drawings, that there are some lines, especially if you create a section perspective, that seem to be a little wonky and don't make sense. So, for example, looking here at this drawing, if I get my annotate command here, this line basically represents, if we took the face off that floor plate, this is basically looking at that floor plate from the inside. Or yeah, the perimeter, or like the each side or each face of that floor plate from the inside. So if you can imagine extending that line and looking past this wall, that floor plate would align with the corner, or this line will align with the corner of the floor plate and probably align with my walls. But as you guys should know by now, with drawing practices and you know, line weights and perspective and poching, you should know by now that you wouldn't see those lines in a section. So I'm just going to go ahead and do some post-process work now to delete these lines. And you might have more show up or less show up, but just be sure to be careful when you export your drawing to make sure that what's being exported is the line work that is accurate to what a plan or section would look like. So delete any unnecessary lines. If you have a complex shape, for example, a cylinder, sometimes cylinder or cylindrical shapes or spherical shapes don't export very well with Make2D. So sometimes you have to go ahead and fix the line and connect it all back. But generally, as you see here, like this is a really quick way to go ahead and make all of your drawings without having to go and draw them from scratch. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Question.
Yes.
Now, what is the difference between this Make2D and a clipping plane in making the normal drawing? Because I'm trying to figure out, you know, when you started with Make2D, then later jump into clipping plane.
Right. So the difference between the two, the clipping plane essentially is the tool you use to cut the plan or cut the section. But that doesn't mean that that is the drawing. You need to export individual lines, as you see here, that you can later go and edit to edit line weights. If you just use the clipping plane on the front view, for example, you see what's being cut through right here. You can't go back or export this information into another program, for example, Illustrator, which we'll be jumping into next class. You won't be able to just take your Rhino model, import it into Illustrator, and edit those line weights. You first have to extract all the line work from your drawing to be able to do that. Which I guess is sort of confusing because I know you're familiar with Revit, where Revit, you cut the section and basically all those line weights and the building materials, the wall materials are made for you. This is sort of taking a step back from that, and it's kind of, you know, taking your Rhino model and exporting drawings like you would edit in AutoCAD, for example. Does that answer your your
Yes,
question?
that means if you want to get the 2D drawing, we have to make 2D. You have to
Yes.
go to make 2D,
Correct.
and making clipping plane is for cutting the section alone.
Exactly. Yes. Great question. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording there.